For 7 years, Margaret Fairfax had shared a name with a man who could not bring himself to share his heart. She was the Duchess of Thornwycke. She wore his ring, sat at the head of his table, bore the weight of his household upon her shoulders. And yet, in 7 years of marriage, Alexander Fairfax, Duke of Thornwycke, had never once looked at her the way a husband looks at a wife he loves. He looked at her the way a man looks at a debt he intends to honor, politely, dutifully, coldly. Tonight, that would change, though not in the way either of them expected. Tonight, in the candlelit ballroom of Ashcombe House, the woman who had shattered Alexander's heart 11 years ago, the woman whose name he had not spoken aloud since the day she vanished from his life, would walk back into the light in a gown the color of claret wine, and every carefully constructed wall Margaret had built her marriage upon would begin, quietly and irreversibly, to crumble. Margaret did not yet know her name. She only knew that when the great doors of Ashcombe House swung open and a hush fell across 300 guests, her husband, a man who never lost his composure, never allowed his face to betray a single private thought, went pale as candle wax, and set down his glass of claret with a hand that was, for the first time in 7 years, unsteady. "Alexander," she whispered, "who is that?" He did not answer her. He did not even seem to hear her. And in that silence, in that terrible, aching silence, Margaret understood something she had feared for 7 long years, but never dared to say aloud. She had married a man whose heart already belonged to someone else. And now that someone else had come home, if you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to subscribe for more Victorian romance tales. Yorkshire, England, 1854. The autumn wind swept low and cold across the moors surrounding Thornwycke Manor, rattling the last brittle leaves from the elms that lined the long carriage drive, and Margaret Fairfax, Duchess of Thornwycke, stood at the tall window of her private sitting room, watching gray clouds gather over the distant hills like a held breath. She was 26, though the servants sometimes forgot, for there was a stillness to her, a composure that made her seem older, wiser, more contained than her years. Her chestnut hair was pinned with customary precision. Her deep blue morning gown was exquisite, tasteful, correct. Everything about the Duchess of Thornwycke was correct. It was, she often thought, the only thing she had left to be. 7 years earlier, when her father's woolen mills had collapsed beneath the weight of a bad harvest and worse investments, it was Alexander Fairfax who had quietly settled every account, who had married her within the month, who had saved her family from a ruin so total it would have swallowed her 2 younger brothers along with it. Society believed it a great love match, the reclusive young duke, suddenly and inexplicably wed to a mill owner's daughter with more grace than fortune. Only Margaret knew the truth. Alexander had never once told her he loved her. Not on their wedding day, in the small stone chapel at Thornwycke, with rain drumming the windows. Not in the 7 years since. He was not cruel. That was the peculiar cruelty of it. He was never cruel. He was attentive to her comfort, generous with her allowance, unfailingly courteous at breakfast. He simply was not present. He moved through their marriage like a man completing a ledger, each entry correct, each sum balanced, and never once did the numbers add up to anything resembling affection. She had asked him once, in the first year, foolish and young and still hopeful, why he had chosen her at all, when there were a dozen wealthier, more fashionable young women in London who would have gladly become his duchess. He had looked at her for a long moment, something unreadable moving behind his gray eyes, and said only, "Because you asked nothing of me, Margaret. That is worth more to a man than you might imagine." She had not understood then what he meant. She understood now, 7 quiet years later, standing at a window with the Yorkshire moors stretching gray and empty before her, an ache in her chest she had long since stopped naming. He had chosen her because she would not demand his heart, because some part of him, some wounded, guarded part, had already decided his heart was not his to give. A soft knock came at the door. Her lady's maid, Nora, entered with a folded letter upon a small silver tray, her cheeks pink from the cold corridor. "An invitation, Your Grace, from Lady Ashcombe. A ball, come Friday fortnight, to celebrate the return of her cousin from the continent. All of London society is speaking of nothing else, they say, though I'm sure I don't know why a returning cousin should cause such a stir." Margaret took the letter without particular interest. There were always balls, Always invitations, always the same 300 faces rearranged into new configurations of gossip and ambition. She broke the wax seal and read, and then she read it again, more slowly, as though the words might rearrange themselves into something less alarming. In honor of the return to England of Mrs. Isolde Marchmont, lately of Florence, the name meant nothing to Margaret. But something in her chest tightened all the same, some instinct she could not name, as if her body understood a danger her mind had not yet grasped. "Is something amiss, Your Grace?" Nora asked, watching her mistress's face. "No," Margaret said, folding the letter carefully. "Nothing at all, only a name I do not recognize." She set the invitation upon her writing desk and told herself it was nothing. A stranger, a ball like any other. She would not permit herself to feel the small cold shiver that had crept along her arms, nor to wonder why the very ink of that name seemed to carry a weight she could not explain. She did not yet know that she was wrong about all of it. Alexander Fairfax had not always been a cold man. There had been a version of him, younger, warmer, dangerously open-hearted, who had once believed himself the most fortunate man in England. At 23, freshly returned from Oxford, with a head full of poetry and a heart entirely unguarded, he had fallen in love with Isolde Marchmont, the way young men in novels fall in love, entirely, recklessly, without reservation. She had been the daughter of a baronet, clever and vivacious, with a laugh that filled a room and dark eyes that seemed to promise 1,000 secrets meant only for him. They were engaged within the season. Alexander had commissioned a ring set with a single emerald the color of the ivy at Thornwycke, had written her letters so tender he would later burn them out of shame, had believed, truly believed, that he had found the great love of his life, the one certainty in a world of uncertainties. 3 days before their wedding, Isolde was gone. Not dead, not ill, gone. Vanished to the continent with a wealthy Florentine merchant she had been secretly corresponding with for the better part of a year, leaving Alexander nothing but a brief, almost business-like letter explaining that she required a life of greater possibility than a duke's household in the Yorkshire moors could offer her. He had never spoken of it since, not to his mother, before her death, not to his closest friends at his club, not to a single living soul. He had simply closed a door inside himself, brick by brick, and never opened it again. When Margaret's father came to him in desperation 5 years later, half mad with worry over his failing mills, Alexander had seen an opportunity, not for love, which he no longer believed himself capable of, but for a kind of peace, a quiet, dutiful marriage to a woman who wanted nothing from him but security. A wife who would not ask him to feel what he had trained himself, brutally and thoroughly, never to feel again. He told himself, in the 7 years since, that he had made Margaret a good husband. He had never raised his voice to her, never humiliated her, never taken a mistress, though God knew half the peers of his acquaintance kept one openly, and made no secret of it at their clubs. He gave her everything a duchess could want, everything, that was but himself. It was only now, standing alone in his study with Lady Ashcombe's invitation in his hand, reading the name Isolde Marchmont upon the cream-colored card, that Alexander understood how thoroughly he had lied to himself. He had not closed that door. He had only papered over it, and the paper was tearing now, and behind it he could feel 11 years of grief rising up like floodwater behind a cracked dam. He set the invitation down upon his desk with a hand that trembled, very slightly, and did not notice it trembling at all. She is coming back, he thought. After 11 years, she is coming back to England. And beneath that thought, quieter, more shameful, a second one rose unbidden, and he hated himself for thinking it even as it formed. Why does some part of me still want to see her face? He poured himself a brandy he did not drink, and sat long into the evening with the fire burning low, and did not once think to send word to his wife that dinner might proceed without him. The fortnight that followed passed for Margaret in a strange, suspended quiet. She noticed things she had trained herself, over 7 years, not to notice. The way Alexander's gaze grew distant at dinner, fixed on some point beyond the candlelight that had nothing to do with the room they sat in. The way he answered her questions a beat too late, as though summoned back from somewhere far away. The way, twice now, she had passed his study and heard nothing within but silence, and yet had known, with a wife's strange instinct, that he was not resting but remembering. She asked Nora, carefully, discreetly, whether the servants' hall had heard anything of this Mrs. Marchmont, and Nora, who prided herself on knowing everything worth knowing in 3 counties, had gone uncharacteristically quiet before admitting, in a low voice, that the housekeeper recalled the name from long before Margaret's own marriage. Recalled it, in fact, connected to whispers of a broken engagement, a scandal hushed so thoroughly it had faded from London's memory within a season. "They do say, Your Grace," Nora had added reluctantly, "that his Grace was once engaged to be married, before yourself, to a young lady who left him at the very altar steps, nearly, ran off to the continent with another gentleman entirely. It was a dreadful business, by all accounts, though nobody speaks of it now. I'd not have mentioned it, only, well, the name on that invitation." Margaret had thanked her, and said nothing more, but that night, alone in her chamber, she had sat for a long while before her mirror, studying her own reflection with a critical, searching eye, as though she might find, somewhere in her own face, the answer to a question she had carried, unspoken, for 7 years. Was there always a ghost in this house? Have I been sharing my husband's table with a memory all along? She thought of every dinner where Alexander had gone silent mid-sentence, staring into some middle distance she had never understood. Every anniversary he had marked with a polite gift and nothing more. Every night he had retired to his own chambers without so much as a good-night kiss upon her brow. She had told herself, for 7 years, that this was simply his nature, a reserved man, a private man, a man who loved in his own quiet way, if he loved at all. Now she wondered whether he had ever loved at all, or whether every ounce of warmth he might have given her had been buried, 11 years past, beneath the departure of a woman whose name he could not bring himself to speak. She did not confront him. Pride, and perhaps fear of the answer, kept her silent. But on the evening of the ball, as Nora laced her into a gown of deep sapphire silk, chosen, though Margaret would not have admitted it even to herself, with rather more care than usual, she caught her own eyes in the mirror and felt something harden quietly within her. Whatever tonight brings, she thought, I will not stand in that ballroom and be pitied. Ashcombe House blazed with candlelight the evening of the ball, 3 great crystal chandeliers throwing gold across a sea of silk and satin, the air thick with hothouse flowers shipped up from London by the crate, and the low murmur of 300 conversations, all of them, Margaret suspected, orbiting the same delicious rumor that had traveled faster than any carriage. Isolde Marchmont has returned. Did you hear? The very same Isolde Marchmont who jilted the Duke of Thornwycke, 11 years past. Margaret had heard the whispers in the receiving line, had watched heads turn subtly toward her and then away, the particular cruelty of aristocratic pity, sympathy dressed as gossip, gossip dressed as concern. Poor Duchess. Does she know? Surely she knows. She had not known, not truly, until a fortnight ago. Not until she had watched her husband's carefully composed face crack, for one unguarded instant, into something that looked unbearably like grief. Alexander stood beside her now in the receiving line, resplendent in black evening dress, his jaw set in the particular hard line she had learned, over 7 years, meant he was holding himself together through sheer force of will. He had not spoken more than a dozen words to her all evening. "You seem distracted, Your Grace," Margaret said quietly, as they moved through the opening figures of a quadrille, her gloved hand resting lightly against his. It was the closest thing to a question she dared ask him in public. "Forgive me," he said. "I have a great deal on my mind." "So I have observed." She kept her voice light, though something sharp turned beneath her ribs. "Is there anything I might do to ease it?" He looked at her then, truly looked at her, for the first time in what felt like months, and for one strange, suspended moment, something flickered behind his gray eyes that was not quite coldness, something almost like regret. "No, Margaret," he said, very quietly, "I do not think there is anything to be done tonight." The music turned them apart before she could answer, and when they came together again, his face had closed once more, smooth and distant as a portrait hung too long in a cold gallery. It was at that moment, as the quadrille drew to its close, and the dancers dispersed in a rustle of silk, that the doors at the far end of the ballroom opened, and the murmur of 300 conversations died into a single, breathless hush. Margaret turned, as everyone turned, to see a woman standing in the doorway. She was beautiful, there was no denying it, though Margaret's heart wished fiercely, uselessly, that she might be otherwise. Dark-haired, elegantly tall, gowned in claret-colored silk that seemed almost defiant amid the pastel gowns of London's unmarried daughters scattered through the crowd. She wore the confidence of a woman who had always known she would be watched, and had long ago decided she rather enjoyed it. Beside Margaret, Alexander went very still. "Alexander," Margaret whispered, "who is that?" He did not answer. He was staring across the ballroom with an expression she had never once seen upon his face in 7 years of marriage, raw, unguarded, undone, as though 11 years had folded in upon themselves and he was 23 again, standing at the edge of a wedding that would never happen. Isolde Marchmont's eyes swept the room with practiced ease, and then found him. She smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was, Margaret thought with a chill she could not explain, the smile of a woman who had come home to reclaim something she still considered hers by right. "Alexander," Margaret said again, more urgently now, her fingers tightening on his sleeve. "Who is she?" At last he turned to her, and in his eyes, Margaret saw something break, quietly, invisibly, but unmistakably. "Her name," he said, "is Isolde. She was to have been my wife." Margaret did not weep. She would not give the ballroom that satisfaction, and God knew, 300 pairs of eyes were waiting for exactly such a spectacle, fans already fluttering with barely contained anticipation. She excused herself with perfect composure, found the card room, took a single glass of ratafia she did not drink, and sat with her spine straight and her hands folded in her lap until the trembling in her chest subsided into something she could master. She was to have been my wife. 6 words. 6 words to explain 7 years of distance, 7 years of careful courtesy that had never once become warmth, 7 years of a marriage that Margaret had told herself, again and again, was simply Alexander's nature, a reserved man, a private man, a man who loved in his own quiet way. He had never loved her at all. He had simply never stopped loving someone else. Through the card room's open door, she could see across the corridor into the ballroom, where Alexander now stood, rigid as a man before a firing squad, as Isolde Marchmont crossed the floor toward him with the unhurried grace of a woman who knew every eye in the room was upon her. "Your Grace," Isolde said. Margaret could hear it clearly. The room had gone quiet enough for gossip to travel like a struck bell. "It has been a very long time. Mrs. Marchmont." Alexander's voice was carefully even. "I had not expected you in England." "No," she said, and something in her tone made Margaret's stomach turn cold. "I don't suppose you had. Though I confess, I have thought of you often, in Florence. I read of your marriage, you know, to a mill owner's daughter." Her eyes flicked, briefly, dismissively, toward the card room, toward Margaret, and then away, as though Margaret were a minor inconvenience rather than a wife. "How very practical of you." Margaret set down her untouched glass, rose from her chair, and walked back into the ballroom with her chin lifted and her heart hammering beneath her sapphire silk bodice. Whatever else was true, whatever Alexander's heart had or had not given her in 7 years, she was still the Duchess of Thornwycke, and she would not be spoken of, in her own presence, as though she were a piece of furniture, however finely upholstered. "Mrs. Marchmont," she said, arriving at Alexander's side and extending a hand with perfect glacial civility. "How very good of you to return to England. I do hope Florence was everything you hoped it would be, and more besides." Something flickered in Isolde's dark eyes, surprise perhaps, or the faintest edge of respect, quickly masked beneath practiced elegance. "Your Grace," Isolde said, inclining her head with exquisite, insincere courtesy. "You must be Margaret." "I am." Margaret's smile did not waver. "And you, I understand, are the reason my husband nearly did not marry at all. I confess I owe you a strange sort of gratitude. Had you stayed, I should never have become a duchess." A ripple of scandalized delight moved through the nearest onlookers, fans stilling mid-flutter. Alexander's head turned sharply toward his wife, astonishment plain upon his face. Margaret had never, in 7 years, spoken with such an edge, and certainly never in public. Isolde's smile thinned. "How very bold of you, Your Grace." "I find boldness suits me," Margaret said. "On the rare occasions I permit myself the indulgence." She turned to Alexander, and though her public smile remained fixed, her eyes, meeting his, were unmistakably hard. "Alexander, I find I have a headache. Would you be so good as to call for the carriage?" It was not a request. Alexander, still visibly shaken, offered his arm without a word, and the Duke and Duchess of Thornwycke departed Ashcombe House in a silence so complete that half of London would be discussing it by breakfast. Neither of them spoke a single word during the long, cold carriage ride home across the moors. It was well past midnight when Margaret, having dismissed Nora and unpinned her own hair for the first time in years without assistance, heard a knock upon her chamber door. She had not expected him. In 7 years, Alexander had never once come to her rooms uninvited, and certainly never at such an hour. "Come in," she said, and was faintly astonished at how steady her voice remained. He entered still in his evening coat, though he had removed his cravat, and there was something in his bearing, some rawness, some absence of his usual armor, that made him look, for the first time since she had known him, entirely human, entirely undone. "I owe you an explanation," he said, "and an apology, though I fear it is 11 years overdue, and directed at the wrong woman entirely." Margaret turned from her mirror to face him fully. "Then give it." He crossed to the window, his back to her, his hands clasped behind him, in the manner of a man bracing himself against a wind she could not feel. "Isolde and I were engaged when I was 23. I loved her, foolishly, entirely, the way only very young men love. 3 days before our wedding, she left for the continent with another man's fortune, and never once looked back." He paused, and his voice, when it came again, was rougher. "I have not spoken her name aloud, to anyone, in 11 years. Tonight was the first time since it happened, that I have seen her face." "I gathered as much," Margaret said quietly, "from the fact that you looked as though you had seen a ghost rise up out of the ballroom floor. I felt as though I had." He turned to face her at last, and his gray eyes, in the candlelight, looked almost haunted, older than his years. "Margaret, I must tell you something I have never told you, and I do not know how to say it without wounding you, though I fear it will wound you regardless of how gently I try." She lifted her chin, bracing herself. "Say it. When I married you," Alexander said slowly, "I did not believe myself capable of loving anyone again. I told myself I had closed that part of my heart forever, and that a marriage of duty and quiet respect would suffice, for both of us. I believed I was being honest with you, in my own way, by never pretending to a passion I did not feel." He drew a breath. "I have come to understand, only tonight, watching your face across that ballroom, how great a cruelty that honesty has been. I gave you 7 years of my courtesy, Margaret, and none of my heart. You deserved better than a husband's ledger. You deserved a husband." Margaret's eyes stung, and she hated it, hated that after 7 years of careful composure, it was this, finally, that undid her. "Do you know," she said, her voice not quite steady, "what it is to live 7 years beside a man, to share his table and his name and his bed on the rare occasions he remembered he had a wife, and to feel, every single day, that you are being tolerated? I have asked myself for 7 years, what was wrong with me, Alexander? What flaw kept you from loving me? I did not know, until tonight, that the answer had nothing to do with me at all." "Margaret, no," she said, rising now, her composure cracking at last into something fierce and long buried. "Let me finish. I have been patient. I have been dutiful. I have told myself, again and again, that quiet endurance was a virtue, that a good wife does not demand affection she has not earned. But I am tired, Alexander, of being a woman who asks nothing. I do not know if I can go on being your Duchess in name while remaining a stranger to you in truth. I do not know if I want to." The silence that followed was long, and into it, Alexander said, very quietly, "What would you have me do?" "I would have you decide," Margaret said, "whether I am your wife or merely your arrangement. And I would have you decide quickly, because Isolde Marchmont has returned to England, and I do not intend to spend 1 more year of my life waiting to discover which one of us you have truly chosen." She did not wait for his answer. She turned back to her mirror, and after a long moment, she heard the door close quietly behind him. She did not know, as she sat alone in the candlelight with tears finally sliding free, that Alexander stood on the other side of that door for a full quarter hour, his hand pressed flat against the wood, unable to make himself walk away. If you're still with me, subscribe so you never miss these emotional historical stories. Alexander did not send for Isolde Marchmont. He told himself this, again and again, in the days that followed, as though the simple fact of his own restraint might undo the damage of a single unguarded evening. But restraint, Margaret was learning, was not the same as resolution. He grew quieter in the week that followed the ball. Not cold, precisely, but distracted in a way that gnawed at her more than his old distance ever had. Twice she came upon him with a letter half hidden beneath his hand, and though he made no move to conceal it from her outright, something in his haste to fold it away told her plainly enough that it was a subject he did not wish to discuss. She told herself it was nothing. Business correspondence, estate matters. She told herself this several times, with the particular firmness of a woman who does not entirely believe her own reassurances. It was Lady Ashcombe herself, calling upon Margaret under the pretense of returning a borrowed shawl, who let slip, with the studied carelessness of a woman who had come expressly to deliver news and dress it as accident, that Mrs. Marchmont had taken rooms in London for the season, and had been seen, only 2 days past, walking in Hyde Park in the company of a gentleman answering rather precisely to the Duke of Thornwycke's description. "I am sure it was nothing at all," Lady Ashcombe said, with the particular relish of a woman who hoped very much that it was something. "His Grace no doubt had business in town. One cannot credit every rumor. Your Grace? Truly one cannot." Margaret smiled, and thanked her for the shawl, and felt something cold settle beneath her ribs the moment the door had closed behind her guest. Business in town. Alexander had indeed gone to London 3 days prior. On estate matters, he had told her. A meeting with his solicitor regarding a boundary dispute with a neighboring landholder. It was, she reminded herself firmly, entirely plausible. London was full of solicitors, and full, too, of Hyde Park's fashionable walking hours, where half the peerage promenaded daily without particular design. And yet, she thought of his face in the ballroom, that unguarded, undone look, the look of a man 11 years younger, still capable of being wounded by a name. She thought of the letter half hidden beneath his hand. She thought, with a bitterness that shamed her even as she felt it, of 7 years spent asking nothing, and wondered whether her newfound boldness had come a fortnight too late to matter. When Alexander returned from London 2 days later, Margaret received him in the drawing-room with perfect composure and asked, with a lightness she did not feel, whether his business with the solicitor had prospered. "Tolerably," he said, and something in his tone, too brief, too careful, confirmed every fear Lady Ashcombe's gossip had planted. "The boundary matter is nearly settled." "And did you have occasion?" Margaret asked, keeping her eyes upon her needlework, her voice admirably even, "to walk in Hyde Park while you were in town?" A pause, brief but unmistakable. "I did," Alexander said. "I encountered Mrs. Marchmont there, quite by chance. We spoke for a few minutes only, on matters of no consequence." "I see." Margaret set another stitch, though her hands were no longer entirely steady. "And did you think, Alexander, that this was a matter you might have mentioned to me yourself, rather than leaving me to hear it second-hand from Lady Ashcombe, dressed up as gossip for her own amusement?" He had the grace, at least, to look ashamed. "I did not think it signified enough to mention." "Did you not?" Margaret set down her needlework entirely now, and met his eyes. "Or did you fear, perhaps, that if you spoke her name aloud in this house, you might have to examine too closely why you sought her out at all? Chance encounter, or otherwise?" "Margaret, I did not seek her out. I give you my word." "I do not doubt your word, Alexander. I doubt your heart." Her voice, though quiet, cut sharper than she had intended, sharper perhaps than she had known she felt. "A fortnight ago you told me you wished to try, to be a true husband to me, at long last. And within a fortnight I find you have spoken with the very woman who broke that heart 11 years ago, and said not one word of it to me. What am I to think? What am I to feel, watching you disappear into London and return with her name upon your lips before mine?" Alexander was silent for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was low, stripped of its usual composure. "I do not know how to answer you, except to say that I have spent 11 years believing myself broken, beyond mending, and old wounds, Margaret, do not close simply because a man wishes them to. I did not go to London to see her, but when I did see her, I confess I do not entirely know what I felt. Confusion, perhaps, old grief, unfinished. I do not think it was love, not any longer, but I cannot yet swear to you it was nothing, and I will not lie to you again by pretending otherwise. It was, Margaret thought, both the most honest and the most painful thing he had ever said to her. "Then I suppose," she said quietly, rising from her chair. "We have a great deal further to go than I had hoped." She left him alone in the drawing room, and did not see him again until dinner, which passed in a silence far colder than any that had come before their fragile fortnight of hope. It was nearly a week later, with the strain between them still unresolved, and the great halls of Thornwycke Manor grown quiet with a tension the servants had begun to notice and whisper of, that a visitor arrived whom neither Alexander nor Margaret expected. Her name was Mrs. Helena Whitcomb, and she introduced herself, with evident nervousness, as the sister-in-law of the late Signor Rinaldo Vitali, Isolde Marchmont's husband, who had died in Florence some 8 months prior, under circumstances Mrs. Whitcomb described, in a low and careful voice, as not entirely settled to the family's satisfaction. She was shown into the drawing room, where Alexander and Margaret received her together. A small thing, Margaret noted, that would not have happened a fortnight ago, and which cost them both, she suspected, a considerable effort of will to arrange. "Forgive my intrusion, your graces," Mrs. Whitcomb said, twisting her gloved hands, "but when I learned Isolde had returned to England, and that she had been seen, more than once, in company with you, your grace, I felt I could not in good conscience remain silent, whatever the cost to my own comfort." "Speak plainly, Mrs. Whitcomb," Alexander said, his voice grave. "What is it you fear?" Mrs. Whitcomb drew from her reticule a small, leather-bound journal, worn soft at the corners, its pages edged with the particular yellow of some months' careful handling. "This belonged to my brother-in-law, the Signor. He kept it faithfully until the week of his death. In it, he expresses grave suspicions regarding his wife. Suspicions of poison, your grace. Slow poison, administered over many months, disguised as a wasting illness. The physicians called it a decline of the lungs. I have never believed it, not for one moment, though I dared not say so while she remained abroad." Margaret felt the blood leave her face. Beside her, Alexander had gone rigid as stone, his hand tightening upon the arm of his chair. "She married him for his fortune," Mrs. Whitcomb continued, her voice dropping further, as though even the walls of Thornwycke Manor might carry the words to unfriendly ears. "As I fear she once intended to marry you, your grace, before a wealthier prospect presented itself in Florence. Now that Signor Vitali's fortune is largely spent, his family contested the will most bitterly, and she inherited far less than she had anticipated, and less still after the legal costs. I believe she has returned to England to seek out old prospects, wealthier ones, and more forgiving." Her eyes moved, meaningfully, to Alexander. "I could not, in conscience, allow her to reach you without warning of what she is capable." Alexander took the journal with hands that were not entirely steady, and read, in silence, for several long minutes, while Margaret watched his face pass through disbelief, horror, and finally something that looked almost like grief for the young man he had once been, the boy who had loved a woman capable of this. "Thank you, Mrs. Whitcomb," he said at last, very quietly, closing the journal with care. "You have done both myself and my wife a very great service, at some risk to yourself, I think." "I could not live with my silence, your grace, whatever the risk," Mrs. Whitcomb said simply. "There has been enough of that already, in my family." After Mrs. Whitcomb had gone, escorted to her carriage with Alexander's own thanks and the promise of his family's protection should she need it, he sat for a long while with the journal closed upon his knee, staring into the cold hearth. Margaret sat beside him, not touching him, but close, closer than she might have dared a fortnight before, and closer than the strain of recent days might have suggested possible. "I spent 11 years, he said finally, believing I had loved a woman who broke my heart through weakness, through simple faithlessness, the ordinary sort of cruelty young hearts inflict upon one another. I find now that I mourned a woman who never existed at all. The Isolde I loved at 23 was an invention, a girl who laughed easily and meant it. The Isolde who returned to that ballroom is a woman who may have poisoned her own husband for his fortune, and who came to England, I now understand with sickening clarity, in search of mine. Alexander." Margaret's voice was gentle, though her heart still carried the bruise of the week just past. "You could not have known." "No," he agreed, "but I could have chosen, 7 years ago, to see the woman standing in front of me instead of the ghost behind my eyes. And I could have chosen, this past week, to tell you the truth the moment I encountered her in that park, rather than let you learn of my weakness from Lady Ashcombe's idle gossip." He turned to her at last, and something in his gaze had shifted, the wariness of the past week gone, replaced by something raw and searching. "Margaret, I have wasted 11 years mourning a woman unworthy of a single tear, and very nearly wasted these past 7 days wounding the one woman who has never once given me cause to doubt her. I do not yet know how to love the way you deserve to be loved, but I am asking you, not as your husband demanding your patience, but as a man asking a far better woman than he deserves. Will you allow me to prove I have learned something at long last?" For a long moment, Margaret studied his face, weighing the events of the past fortnight, the wound of the ballroom, the sting of Hyde Park, and now this raw, unguarded honesty that asked nothing of her but the chance to try again. "Yes," she said softly, reaching across the small distance between them and placing her hand in his. "But Alexander, no more silences, no more letters folded away. If we are to build something true between us, it must be built in daylight, not in the shadows of things unsaid." "Agreed," he said, and meant it more fully than he had meant anything in 11 years. News, in London, travels faster than carriages, and Isolde Marchmont heard within 2 days that Mrs. Whitcomb had lately been received at Thornwycke Manor, and that the Duke and Duchess had since been seen walking together through the village near the estate, arm in arm, heads bent close in conversation, a couple that looked, to every onlooker, considerably more united than the strained pair London had gossiped over only a fortnight prior. She understood, with the cold clarity of a woman whose schemes were unraveling, that her welcome in England had grown considerably shorter than she had planned, and that whatever leverage she had once possessed over a still grieving young duke had crumbled along with his grief. She called at Thornwycke Manor the following week regardless, uninvited and unannounced, arriving in a hired carriage with the particular boldness of a woman who has nothing left to lose and everything yet to gain. She was received, at Margaret's own insistence, over Alexander's initial hesitation, in the same drawing room where, days before, a frightened widow's sister had laid bare the truth of a husband's death. "Your Grace," Isolde said to Alexander, ignoring Margaret entirely, her voice pitched with the old warmth that had once undone him utterly. "I had hoped we might speak privately, as old friends." "Anything you wish to say to me," Alexander said, his voice steady, in a way it had not been in the ballroom a fortnight past, "you may say in front of my wife." "We keep no secrets in this house any longer, Mrs. Marchmont." Isolde's composure flickered, just slightly, her eyes narrowing at the word wife, spoken with such unmistakable weight. "Julian, Alexander," she corrected herself. "Surely you remember what we once were to one another. Surely that counts for something, after all this time, whatever misfortunes I have suffered since." "I remember," Alexander said, and his voice, though quiet, carried a steel Margaret had never heard in it before their trials of the past fortnight. "A young man who loved you with his whole foolish heart, and a woman who left him 3 days before their wedding for a wealthier man's title. I remember, more recently, a journal belonging to your late husband, Mrs. Marchmont, which makes for very troubling reading indeed. Troubling enough that I have already taken the liberty of placing a copy of its contents in the hands of my solicitor." All color left Isolde's face. "I do not know what lies that woman has told you," she began, her voice rising with the particular brittleness of a cornered animal, "but Helena Whitcomb has hated me since the day of my marriage, and would say anything." "I think you know precisely what was written in that journal, Mrs. Marchmont," Margaret said, rising from her chair and crossing to stand beside her husband, not behind him, not in his shadow, but beside him, as an equal. As she had learned these past difficult weeks, she had every right to be. "I think you came to England believing you would find a grieving young duke, still nursing an 11-year-old wound, easily reopened, easily exploited, for whatever fortune remained to be had. I am sorry to disappoint you. You will find the Duke of Thornwycke is no longer so easily wounded, and you will find, too, that I will not permit you to try again, whatever advantage his old grief might once have offered you." "You dare!" Isolde began, color flooding back into her cheeks in a rush of fury. "I dare a very great deal, Mrs. Marchmont," Margaret said calmly, though her heart hammered beneath her composed exterior. "I have spent 7 years learning patience, and this past fortnight learning that patience, without honesty, is merely a slower kind of suffering. I find I have very little patience left for women who poison their husbands and then come hunting for new fortunes to devour. I suggest you leave England before Mrs. Whitcomb's suspicions become a matter for the magistrates, rather than mere drawing-room gossip that can still, perhaps, be outrun." For a long, taut moment, Isolde Marchmont stood frozen, calculation and fury warring plainly across her lovely, haunted face. Then, seeing nothing further to be gained, and a very great deal to be lost, she gathered what remained of her dignity, inclined her head with icy civility toward them both, and swept from the room without another word. Her carriage could be heard rattling away down the long drive within minutes, and it was, so far as either the Duke or Duchess of Thornwycke would ever learn, the last that England saw of her. The door closed behind her with a soft, final click that seemed, to Margaret, to close something far larger than a single afternoon's unwelcome visit. Alexander turned to Margaret, something like wonder breaking across his face. "I do not believe," he said slowly, "I have ever seen anything quite so magnificent in my life. Nor do I believe I deserve the wife standing before me, after the doubts I gave her cause to feel." Margaret, feeling suddenly and entirely herself for the first time in years, allowed herself, at last, to smile without restraint. "You do not deserve me yet, perhaps," she said, with the faintest, teasing edge of the boldness she had discovered in herself these past weeks. "But I find I am willing to let you earn it, Alexander, provided you continue as you have begun today." "Then I shall spend the whole of my life earning it," he said, "and count myself fortunate for the chance." The weeks that followed were not without their awkwardness. 7 years of careful distance, and a fortnight's fresh wound besides, could not be undone in a single afternoon's confrontation, however satisfying. But something had shifted between the Duke and Duchess of Thornwycke that all of Yorkshire, within a month, had noticed and begun, delightedly, to discuss over their own tea tables. Alexander began joining Margaret for breakfast. Not out of habit or duty, but because, he told her one morning with an honesty that still surprised them both, he found he preferred the start of his day in her company to the start of it alone, poring over correspondence in his study while she sat elsewhere in the great house, unseen and unconsidered. He asked about her brothers, remembered the names of her favorite novels, discovered, with something like shame, how little he had troubled to know of the woman he had been married to for 7 years. Margaret, for her part, found herself laughing more freely than she had in years. A low, genuine laugh she had not realized she still possessed until Alexander, dry and unexpectedly witty once his guard had lowered fully, coaxed it from her over a shared joke about Lady Ashcombe's insufferable habit of arriving fashionably late to her own dinners. He began, too, to speak of small things: the running of the estate, a tenant's difficulty with a leaking roof, a decision regarding the planting of the spring fields, matters he would once have settled alone, in silence, without troubling her opinion. Margaret found, to her quiet surprise, that he valued her judgment more than she had ever been permitted to know, and that a marriage built on shared decisions, however small, felt entirely different from one built on polite, separate silences. One evening in late November, as the first hard frost of winter settled silver over the moors beyond Thornwycke Manor, Alexander found Margaret in the library, curled into a window seat with a book she was not, he suspected, actually reading, her eyes fixed instead on the darkening fields beyond the glass.
"May I?"
he asked, gesturing to the seat beside her. "You may," she said, and made room, as she had learned, these past weeks, always to do. For a long while, they simply sat together in comfortable silence, watching the frost creep across the window glass in delicate patterns, and Margaret thought, with a quiet and unfamiliar contentment, that this simple, ordinary closeness was worth more than every jewel and gown Alexander had ever given her in 7 years of dutiful, distant marriage. "Margaret," Alexander said at last, his voice low, "I have been trying, this past month, to find the words to tell you something, and I find I am still, after all these years, a poor hand at honesty when it matters most. So I will simply say it plainly, and hope you will forgive its clumsiness, and forgive me, too, for the week I spent doubting my own heart when I ought to have trusted it." She turned to face him, her heart suddenly unsteady. "I do not believe," he said, "that what I feel for you now bears any resemblance to what I once felt, at 23, for a woman who did not deserve it, and who I understand now I loved more as an idea than as a person truly known. What I feel for you has grown slowly, quietly, Over 7 years, I did not have the courage to notice it. In every kindness you showed my household, every grace with which you bore my neglect, every ounce of dignity you carried in a marriage that offered you so little in return, and every ounce of courage you showed this past month, when I gave you every reason to doubt me, and you chose, instead, to fight for what we might yet become. I do not think this is the sudden, reckless love of youth, Margaret. I think it is something far better, something built rather than merely felt. I think it is the love of a man who has finally, fully opened his eyes to what was in front of him all along. Margaret's eyes filled, and this time she did not try to hide it. "I love you," Alexander said simply. "I do not know how I did not see it sooner, and I am sorrier than I can say for every day I made you wait for words you deserve to hear on the very first, and sorrier still for the doubt I let creep between us this past month, however briefly." "Alexander!" Margaret's voice broke on his name. "I have loved you, I think, since very nearly the beginning, foolishly, hopelessly, long after I told myself I ought to stop, and even, God forgive me, through this last difficult fortnight, when I feared I had been foolish to hope at all. I only feared I would go my whole life without hearing you say it back, and mean it as fully as you mean it now." He reached for her then, his hand coming to rest against her cheek with a tenderness 7 years of careful distance had never once permitted, and when he kissed her, softly, searchingly, as though relearning something he had forgotten he knew, Margaret felt 7 years of quiet heartbreak, and a fortnight's fresh doubt besides, dissolve entirely into something warm and whole and, at long last, real. It was not, however, quite the end of the matter. For scandal, once loosed upon London society, does not vanish simply because the parties involved have found their happiness. Word had spread, as Mrs. Whitcomb's courage and Isolde Marchmont's hasty departure became known, of the suspicions surrounding the late Signor Vitali's death, and by midwinter, London's drawing rooms buzzed with speculation that reached even the quiet moors of Yorkshire. Some whispered that Isolde had fled England entirely, back to the continent, one step ahead of an investigation her own family connections could no longer suppress. Others claimed she had been seen boarding a ship for America, determined to begin her schemes anew where no one yet knew her name. Alexander received a final letter that winter, not from Isolde herself, but from a solicitor engaged on her behalf, threatening vague and insubstantial legal action should the Duke's household continue to circulate defamatory suggestions regarding her character. Alexander read it once, showed it to Margaret without a flicker of the old hesitation that might once have kept it hidden, and then consigned it calmly to the fire. "She has no case," he said, watching the paper curl and blacken among the coals, "and I suspect she knows it. This is the last gasp of a woman who has run out of places to run to." "Do you feel nothing at all, watching it burn?" Margaret asked quietly, studying his face for any last shadow of the old wound. Alexander considered the question with the seriousness it deserved, turning from the fire to look at his wife instead. Really look at her, in the way he had learned, these past months, to do. "I feel sorrow," he admitted, "for the 11-year-old grief of a young man who loved foolishly and paid for it dearly. I feel gratitude, strange as it sounds, that her return forced a reckoning I might otherwise have avoided for the whole of our marriage, to both our great cost. But I feel no pull toward her, Margaret. Not any longer. Whatever ghost lived in this house alongside us these 7 years, I believe we have finally together laid it to rest." Margaret crossed the room and took his hand, and felt for the first time since that terrible evening at Ashcombe House that the matter was truly, entirely closed. The following spring, Thornwycke Manor hosted its first grand ball in over a decade, a fact that set the whole of Yorkshire's drawing rooms alight with anticipation, for it was widely known by then that the Duke and Duchess of Thornwycke, once the coldest match in the northern peerage, had become, improbably and delightfully, the most devoted couple in the county, if not in all of England. Margaret descended the great oak staircase that evening in pale gold silk, candlelight catching the sapphires at her throat, Alexander's gift, given not out of duty but, as he had told her that very morning, with a smile that still made her breath catch, because I wished, for once, to give my wife something that had nothing whatsoever to do with obligation, and everything to do with how thoroughly I adore her. He was waiting for her at the foot of the stairs, and the look upon his face as she descended, open, unguarded, entirely undone, was one Margaret would treasure for the whole of her life. a look so far removed from the polite, distant courtesy of their first 7 years together that it seemed, at times, almost impossible to believe they were the same two people. "My Duchess," he said softly, offering his arm. "My Duke," she answered, taking it, "who very nearly lost me to his own foolish, guarded heart, not once but twice over." "A mistake," Alexander murmured, leading her toward the ballroom where 300 guests and the first notes of a waltz awaited them, the great chandeliers of Thornwycke Manor blazing with a warmth the house had not known in a decade. "I intend to spend the whole of my remaining life making up for one dance, one honest word, one open door at a time." As they moved together onto the floor, and the candlelight of Thornwycke Manor gathered gold around them, Margaret thought of the frightened, lonely young woman who had once stood at a rain-swept window overlooking the empty moors, believing herself unloved and unlovable, wondering what flaw in her own heart had kept her husband's affection forever out of reach, and she felt, at last, entirely and completely at peace. She had waited 7 years to be chosen. She had fought, in the fortnight of doubt that followed, to be chosen rightly, and not merely by default of a rival's failure, and it had, in the end, been worth every quiet, patient, and finally courageous day. Thank you for listening. Subscribe for more long romantic Victorian-era stories,